Yes, it would not be the first instance of the kind. Fingers have been severed from dead hands, and even from living ones, for the sake of rings that were too tight to be drawn off. And the fact that it is the left hand supports the suggestion, for a ring that was inconveniently tight would be worn by preference on the left hand, as that is usually slightly smaller than the right. What is the matter, Berkeley?" A sudden light had burst upon me, and I suppose my countenance betrayed the fact. "I am a confounded fool!" I exclaimed. "Oh, don't say that," said Jervis. "Give your friends a chance." "I ought to have seen this long ago and told you about it. John Bellingham did wear a ring, and it was so tight that, when once he had got it on, he could never get it off again." "Do you happen to know on which hand he wore it?" Thorndyke asked. "Yes, it was on the left hand, because Miss Bellingham, who told me about it, said that he would never have been able to get the ring on at all but for the fact that his left hand was slightly smaller than his right." "There it is, then," said Thorndyke. "With this new fact in our possession, the absence of the finger furnishes the starting point of some very curious speculations." "As for instance?" said Jervis. "Ah, under the circumstances I must leave you to pursue those speculations independently. I am now acting for Mr. Bellingham." Jervis grinned and was silent for a while, refilling his pipe thoughtfully, but when he had got it alight he resumed. "To return to the question of the disappearance, you don't consider it highly improbable that Bellingham might have been murdered by Hurst?" "Oh, don't imagine I am making an accusation. I am considering the various probabilities merely in the abstract. The same reasoning applies to the Bellinghams. As to whether any of them did commit the murder, that is a question of personal character. I certainly do not suspect the Bellinghams after having seen them, and with regard to Hurst I know nothing, or at least very little, to his disadvantage." "Do you know anything?" asked Jervis. "Well," said Thorndyke, with some hesitation, "it seems a thought unkind to rake up the little details of a man's past, and yet it has to be done. I have, of course, made the usual routine inquiries concerning the parties to this affair, and this is what they have brought to light. Hurst, as you know, is a stockbroker, a man of good position and reputation. But about 10 years ago he seems to have committed an indiscretion, to put it mildly, which nearly got him into rather serious difficulties. He appears to have speculated rather heavily and considerably beyond his means, for when a sudden spasm of the markets upset his calculations, it turned out that he had been employing his client's capital and securities. For a time it looked as if there was going to be serious trouble. Then, quite unexpectedly, he managed to raise the necessary amount in some way and settle all claims. Whence he got the money has never been discovered to this day, which is a curious circumstance, seeing that the deficiency was rather over £5,000. But the important fact is that he did get it, and that he paid up all that he owed, so that he was only a potential defaulter, so to speak, and discreditable as the affair undoubtedly was, it does not seem to have any direct bearing on this present case." "No," Jervis agreed, "though it makes one consider his position with more attention than one would otherwise." "Undoubtedly," said Thorndyke. "A reckless gambler is a man whose conduct cannot be relied on. He is subject to vicissitudes of fortune which may force him into other kinds of wrongdoing. Many an embezzlement has been preceded by an unlucky plunge on the turf." "Assuming the responsibility for this disappearance to lie between Hurst and the Bellinghams," said I, with an uncomfortable gulp as I mentioned the names of my friends, "to which side does the balance of probability incline?" "To the side of Hurst, I should say, without doubt," replied Thorndyke. "The case stands thus. On the facts presented to us, Hurst appears to have had no motive for killing the deceased, as we will call him, but the man was seen to enter the house, was never seen to leave it, and was never again seen alive. Bellingham, on the other hand, had a motive, as he had believed himself to be the principal beneficiary under the will. But the deceased was not seen at his house, and there is no evidence that he went to the house or to the neighborhood, excepting the scarab that was found there. But the evidence of the scarab is vitiated by the fact that Hurst was present when it was picked up, and that it was found on a spot over which Hurst had passed only a few minutes previously. Until Hurst is cleared, it seems to me that the presence of the scarab proves nothing against the Bellinghams." "Then your opinions on the case," said I, "are based entirely on the facts that have been made public?" "Yes, mainly. I do not necessarily accept those facts just as they are presented, and I may have certain views of my own on the case. But if I have, I do not feel in a position to discuss them. For the present, discussion has to be limited to the facts and inferences offered by the parties concerned." "There!" exclaimed Jervis, rising to knock his pipe out. "That is where Thorndyke has you. He lets you think you're in the thick of the know until one fine morning you wake up and discover that you have only been a gaping outsider. And then you are mightily astonished, and so are the other side, too, for that matter. But we must really be off now, mustn't we, Reverend Senior?" "I suppose we must," replied Thorndyke, and as he drew on his gloves, he asked, "Have you heard from Barnard lately?" "Oh, yes," I answered. "I wrote to him at Smyrna to say that the practice was flourishing, and that I was quite happy and contented, and that he might stay away as long as he liked. He writes by return that he will prolong his holiday if an opportunity offers, but will let me know later." "Gad," said Jervis, "it was a stroke of luck for Barnard that Bellingham happened to have such a magnificent daughter. There, don't mind me, old man. You go in and win. She's worth it, isn't she, Thorndyke?" "Miss Bellingham's a very charming young lady," replied Thorndyke. "I am most favorably impressed by both the father and the daughter, and I only trust that we may be able to be of some service to them." With this sedate little speech, Thorndyke shook my hand, and I watched my two friends go on their way until their fading shapes were swallowed up in the darkness of Fetter Lane. End of chapter 11. Chapter 12 of The Eye of Osiris. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Eye of Osiris by R.Austin Freeman. Chapter 12. A Voyage of Discovery. It was 2 or 3 mornings after my little supper party that, as I stood in the consulting room brushing my hat preparatory to starting on my morning round, Adolphus appeared at the door to announce 2 gentlemen waiting in the surgery. I told him to bring them in, and a moment later Thorndyke entered, accompanied by Jervis. I noted that they looked uncommonly large in that little apartment, especially Thorndyke, but I had no time to consider this phenomenon, for the latter, when he had shaken my hand, proceeded at once to explain the object of their visit. "We have come to ask a favor, Berkeley," he said, "to ask you to do a very great service in the interest of your friends, the Bellinghams." "You know I shall be delighted," I said warmly. "What is it?" "I will explain. You know, or perhaps you don't, that the police have collected all the bones that have been discovered and deposited them in the mortuary at Woodford, where they are to be viewed by the coroner's jury. Now it has become imperative that I should have more definite and reliable information than I can get from the newspapers. The natural thing for me would be to go down and examine them myself, but there are circumstances that make it very desirable that my connection with the case should not leak out. Consequently, I can't go myself, and, for the same reason, I can't send Jervis. On the other hand, as it is now stated pretty openly that the police consider the bones to be almost certainly those of John Bellingham, it would seem perfectly natural that you, as Godfrey Bellingham's doctor, should go down to view them on his behalf." "I should like to," I said. "I would give anything to go. But how is it to be managed? It would mean a whole day off and leaving the practice to look after itself." "I think it could be managed," said Thorndyke, "and the matter is really important for 2 reasons. One is that the inquest opens to-morrow, and someone certainly ought to be there to watch the proceedings on Godfrey's behalf. And the other is that our client has received notice from her solicitors that the application will be heard in the probate court in a few days." "Isn't that rather sudden?" I asked. "It certainly suggests that there has been a good deal more activity than we were given to understand. But you see the importance of the affair. The inquest will be a sort of dress rehearsal for the probate court, and it is quite essential that we should have a chance of estimating the management." "Yes, I see that. But how are we going to manage about the practice?" "We shall find you a substitute." "Through a medical agent?" "Yes," said Jervis. "Turcival will find us a man. In fact, he has done it. I saw him this morning. He has a man who is waiting up in town to negotiate for the purchase of a practice, and who would do the job for a couple of guineas. Quite a reliable man. Only say the word, and I will run off to Adam Street and engage him definitely." "Very well. You engage the locum tenens, and I will be prepared to start for Woodford as soon as he turns up." "Excellent," said Thorndyke. "That is a great weight off my mind. And if you could manage to drop in this evening and smoke a pipe with us, we could talk over the plan of campaign and let you know what items of information we are particularly in want of." I promised to turn up at King's Bench Walk as soon after 8:30 as possible, and my 2 friends then took their departure, leaving me to set out in high spirits on my scanty round of visits. It is surprising what different aspects things present from different points of view. How relative are our estimates of the conditions and circumstances of life. To the urban workman, the journeyman baker or tailor, for instance, laboring year in and year out in a single building, a holiday ramble on Hampstead Heath is a veritable voyage of discovery; whereas to the sailor the shifting panorama of the whole wide world is but the commonplace of the day's work. So I reflected as I took my place in the train at Liverpool Street on the following day. There had been a time when the trip by rail to the borders of Epping Forest would have been far from a thrilling experience. Now, after vegetating in the little world of Fetter Lane, it was quite an adventure. The enforced inactivity of a railway journey is favorable to thought, and I had much to think about. The last few weeks had witnessed momentous changes in my outlook. New interests had arisen, new friendships had grown up, and above all, there had stolen into my life that supreme influence that, for good or for evil, according to my fortune, was to color and pervade it even to its close. Those few days of companionable labor in the reading room, with the homely hospitalities of the milk shop and the pleasant walks homeward through the friendly London streets, had called into existence a new world, a world in which the gracious personality of Ruth Bellingham was the one dominating reality. And thus, as I leaned back in the corner of the railway carriage, with an unlighted pipe in my hand, the events of the immediate past, together with those more problematical ones of the impending future, occupied me rather to the exclusion of the business of the moment, which was to review the remains collected in the Woodford mortuary, until, as the train approached Stratford, the odors of the soap and bone manure factories poured in at the open window and, by a natural association of ideas, brought me back to the object of my quest. As to the exact purpose of this expedition, I was not very clear, but I knew that I was acting as Thorndyke's proxy and thrilled with pride at the thought. But what particular light my investigations were to throw upon the intricate Bellingham case I had no very definite idea. With a view to fixing the procedure in my mind, I took Thorndyke's written instructions from my pocket and read them over carefully. They were very full and explicit, making ample allowance for my lack of experience in medico-legal matters. 1. Do not appear to make minute investigations or in any way excite remark. 2. Ascertain if all the bones belonging to each region are present, and if not, which are missing. 3. Measure the extreme length of the principal bones and compare those of opposite sides. 4. Examine the bones with reference to age, sex, and muscular development of the deceased. 5. Note the presence or absence of signs of constitutional disease, local disease of bone or adjacent structures, old or recent injuries, and any other departures from the normal or usual. 6. Observe the presence or absence of adipocere and its position, if present. 7. Note any remains of tendons, ligaments, or other soft structures. 8. Examine the Sidcup hand with reference to the question as to whether the finger was separated before or after death. 9. Estimate the probable period of submersion and note any changes, as, for example, mineral or organic staining, due to the character of the water or mud. 10. Ascertain the circumstances, immediate and remote, that led to the discovery of the bones and the names of the persons concerned in those circumstances. 11. Commit all information to writing as soon as possible and make plans and diagrams on the spot, if circumstances permit. 12. Preserve an impassive exterior. Listen attentively, but without eagerness. Ask as few questions as possible. Pursue any inquiry that your observations on the spot may suggest. These were my instructions, and considering that I was going merely to inspect a few dry bones, they appeared rather formidable. In fact, the more I read them over, the greater became my misgivings as to my qualifications for the task. As I approached the mortuary, it became evident that some, at least, of Thorndyke's admonitions were by no means unnecessary. The place was in charge of a police sergeant, who watched my approach suspiciously, and some half-dozen men, obviously newspaper reporters, hovered about the entrance like a pack of jackals. I presented the coroner's order which Mr. Marchmont had obtained, and which the sergeant read with his back against the wall, to prevent the newspaper men from looking over his shoulder. My credentials being found satisfactory, the door was unlocked, and I entered, accompanied by 3 enterprising reporters, whom, however, the sergeant summarily ejected and locked out, returning to usher me into the presence and to observe my proceedings with intelligent but highly embarrassing interest. The bones were laid out on a large table covered with a sheet, which the sergeant slowly turned back, watching my face intently as he did so, to note the impression that the spectacle made upon me. I imagined that he must have been somewhat disappointed by my impassive demeanor, for the remains suggested to me nothing more than a rather shabby set of student's osteology. The whole collection had been set out by the police surgeon, as the sergeant informed me, in their proper anatomical order, notwithstanding which I counted them over carefully to make sure that none were missing, checking them by the list with which Thorndyke had furnished me. "I see you have found the left thigh bone," I remarked, observing that this did not appear in the list. "Yes," said the sergeant. "That turned up yesterday evening in a big pond called Baldwin's Pond in the Sandpit Plain, near Little Monk Wood." "Is that near here?" I asked. "In the forest up Loudon way," was the reply. I made a note of the fact, on which the sergeant looked as if he was sorry he had mentioned it, and then turned my attention to a general consideration of the bones before examining them in detail. Their appearance would have been improved and examination facilitated by a thorough scrubbing, for they were just as they had been taken from their respective resting places, and it was difficult to decide whether their reddish-yellow color was an actual stain or due to a deposit on the surface. In any case, as it affected them all alike, I thought it an interesting feature and made a note of it. They bore numerous traces of their sojourn in the various ponds from which they had been recovered, but these gave me little help in determining the length of time during which they had been submerged. They were, of course, encrusted with mud, and little wisps of pond weed stuck to them in places, but these facts furnished only the vaguest measure of time. Some of the traces were, indeed, more informing. To several of the bones, for instance, there adhered the dried egg clusters of the common pond snail, and in one of the hollows of the right shoulder blade, the infraspinous fossa, was a group of the mud-built tubes of the red river worm. These remains gave proof of a considerable period of submersion, and since they could not have been deposited on the bones until all the flesh had disappeared, they furnished evidence that some time, a month or two at any rate, had elapsed since this had happened. Incidentally, too, their distribution showed the position in which the bones had lain, and though this appeared to be of no importance in the existing circumstances, I made careful notes of the situation of each adherent body, illustrating their position by rough sketches. The sergeant watched my proceedings with an indulgent smile. "You're making a regular inventory, sir," he remarked, "as if you were going to put 'em up for auction. I shouldn't think those snail eggs would be much help in identification. And all that has been done already," he added, as I produced my measuring tape. "No doubt," I replied, "but my business is to make independent observations, to check the others if necessary." And I proceeded to measure each of the principal bones separately and to compare those of opposite sides. The agreement in dimensions and general characteristics of the pairs of bones left little doubt that all were parts of one skeleton, a conclusion that was confirmed by the eburnated patch on the head of the right thigh bone and the corresponding patch in the socket of the right hip bone. When I had finished my measurements, I went over the entire series of bones in detail, examining each with the closest attention for any of those signs which Thorndyke had indicated, and eliciting nothing but a monotonously reiterated negative. They were distressingly and disappointingly normal. "Well, sir, what do you make of 'em?" the sergeant asked cheerfully as I shut up my notebook and straightened my back. "Whose bones are they? Are they Mr. Bellingham's, think ye?" "I should be very sorry to say whose bones they are," I replied. "One bone is very much like another, you know." "I suppose it is," he agreed. "But I thought that, with all that measuring and all those notes, you might have arrived at something definite." Evidently he was disappointed in me, and I was somewhat disappointed in myself when I contrasted Thorndyke's elaborate instructions with the meager result of my investigations. For what did my discoveries amount to? And how much was the inquiry advanced by the few entries in my notebook? The bones were apparently those of a man of fair though not remarkable muscular development, over 30 years of age, but how much older I was unable to say. His height I judged roughly to be 5 feet 8 inches, but my measurements would furnish data for a more exact estimate by Thorndyke. Beyond this, the bones were quite uncharacteristic. There were no signs of disease, either local or general, no indication of injuries, either old or recent, no departures of any kind from the normal or usual, and the dismemberment had been effected with such care that there was not a single scratch on any of the separate surfaces. Of adipocere, the peculiar waxy or soapy substance that is commonly found in bodies that have slowly decayed in damp situations, there was not a trace, and the only remnant of the soft structures was a faint indication like a spot of dried glue, of the tendon on the tip of the right elbow. The sergeant was in the act of replacing the sheet, with the air of a showman who has just given an exhibition, when there came a sharp rapping on the mortuary door. The officer finished spreading the sheet with official precision, and having ushered me out into the lobby, turned the key and admitted 3 persons, holding the door open after they had entered for me to go out. But the appearance of the newcomers inclined me to linger. One of them was a local constable, evidently in official charge. A second was a laboring man, very wet and muddy, who carried a small sack, while in the third I thought I scented a professional brother. The sergeant continued to hold the door open. "Nothing more I can do for you, sir?" he asked genially. "Is that the divisional surgeon?" I inquired. "Yes, I am the divisional surgeon," the newcomer answered. "Did you want anything of me?" "This," said the sergeant, "is a medical gentleman who has just got permission from the coroner to inspect the remains. He is acting for the family of the deceased. I mean, for the family of Mr. Bellingham," he added, in answer to an inquiring glance from the surgeon. "I see," said the latter. "Well, they have found the rest of the trunk, including, I understand, the ribs that were missing from the other part. Isn't that so, Davis?" "Yes, sir," replied the constable. "Inspector Badger says all the ribs is here, and all the bones of the neck as well." "The inspector seems to be an anatomist," I remarked. The sergeant grinned. "He's a very knowing gentleman, is Mr. Badger. He came down here this morning quite early and spent a long time looking over the bones and checking them by some notes in his pocketbook. I fancy he's got something on, but he was precious close about it." Here the sergeant shut up rather suddenly, perhaps contrasting his own conduct with that of his superior. "Let us have these new bones out on the table," said the police surgeon. "Take the sheet off, and don't shoot them out as if they were coals. Hand them out carefully." The laborer fished out the wet and muddy bones one by one from the sack, and as he laid them on the table, the surgeon arranged them in their proper relative positions. "This has been a neatly executed job," he remarked. "None of your clumsy hacking with a chopper or a saw. The bones have been cleanly separated at the joints. The fellow who did this must have had some anatomical knowledge, unless he was a butcher, which, by the way, is not impossible. He has used his knife uncommonly skillfully. And you notice that each arm was taken off with the scapula attached, just as a butcher takes off a shoulder of mutton. Are there any more bones in that bag?" "No, sir," replied the laborer, wiping his hands off with an air of finality on the posterior aspect of his trousers. "That's the lot." The surgeon looked thoughtfully at the bones as he gave a final touch to their arrangement, and remarked: "The inspector is right. All the bones of the neck are there. Very odd, don't you think so?" "You mean—" "I mean, this very eccentric murderer seems to have given himself such an extraordinary amount of trouble for no reason that one can see. There are these neck vertebrae, for instance. He must have carefully separated the skull from the atlas, instead of just cutting through the neck. Then there is the way he divided the trunk. The 12th ribs have just come in with this lot, but the 12th dorsal vertebra, to which they belong, was attached to the lower half. Imagine the trouble he must have taken to do that. And without cutting or hacking the bones about, either. It is extraordinary. This is rather interesting, by the way. Handle it carefully." He picked up the breastbone daintily, for it was covered with wet mud, and handed it to me with the remark, "That is the most definite piece of evidence we have." "You mean," I said, "that the union of the two parts into a single mass fixes this as the skeleton of an elderly man?" "Yes, that is the obvious suggestion, which is confirmed by the deposit of bone in the rib cartilages. You can tell the inspector, Davis, that I have checked this lot of bones and that they are all here." "Would you mind writing it down, sir?" said the constable. "Inspector Badger said I was to have everything in writing." The surgeon took out his pocketbook, and while he was selecting a suitable piece of paper, he asked, "Did you form any opinion as to the height of the deceased?" "Yes, I thought he would be about 5 feet 8." Here I caught the sergeant's eye, fixed on me with a knowing leer. "I made it 5 feet 8½ said the police surgeon. "But we shall know better when we have seen the lower leg bones. Where was this lot found, Davis?" "In the pond, just off the road, in Lord's bushes, sir. And the inspector has gone off now to—" "Never mind where he's gone," interrupted the sergeant. "You just answer questions and attend to your business." The sergeant's reproof conveyed a hint to me on which I was not slow to act. Friendly as my professional colleague was, it was clear that the police were disposed to treat me as an interloper who was to be kept out of the know as far as possible. Accordingly, I thanked my colleague and the sergeant for their courtesy, and bidding them adieu until we should meet at the inquest, took my departure and walked away quickly until I found an inconspicuous position from which I could keep the door of the mortuary in view. A few moments later I saw Constable Davis emerge and stride away up the road. I watched his rapidly diminishing figure until he had gone as far as I considered desirable, and then I set forth in his wake. The road led straight away from the village, and in less than half a mile entered the outskirts of the forest. Here I quickened my pace to close up somewhat, and it was well that I did so, for suddenly he diverged from the road into a green lane, where for a while I lost sight of him. Still hurrying forward, I again caught sight of him, just as he turned off into a narrow path that entered a beech wood with a thickish undergrowth of holly, along which I followed him for several minutes, gradually decreasing the distance between us, until suddenly there fell on my ear a rhythmical sound like the clank of a pump. Soon after I caught the sound of men's voices, and then the constable struck off the path into the wood. I now advanced more cautiously, endeavoring to locate the search party by the sound of the pump, and when I had done this I made a little detour so that I might approach from the opposite direction to that from which the constable had appeared. Still guided by the noise of the pump, I at length came out into a small opening among the trees and halted to survey the scene. The center of the opening was occupied by a small pond, not more than a dozen yards across, by the side of which stood a builder's handcart. The little two-wheeled vehicle had evidently been used to convey the appliances which were deposited on the ground near it, and which consisted of a large tub now filled with water, a shovel, a rake, a sieve, and a portable pump, the latter being fitted with a long delivery hose. There were 3 men besides the constable, one of whom was working the handle of the pump, while the other was glancing at a paper that the constable had just delivered to him. He looked up sharply as I appeared, and viewed me with unconcealed disfavor. "Hallo, sir," he said to me. "You can't come here." Now, seeing that I was actually here, this was clearly a mistake, and I ventured to point out the fallacy. "Well, I can't allow you to stay here. Our business is of a private nature." "I know exactly what your business is, Inspector Badger." "Oh, do you?" said he, surveying me with a foxy smile. "And I expect I know what yours is, too. But we can't have any of you newspaper gentry spying on us just at present, so you just be off." I thought it best to undeceive him at once, and accordingly, having explained who I was, I showed him the coroner's permit, which he read with manifest annoyance. "This is all very well, sir," said he as he handed me back the paper, "but it doesn't authorize you to come spying on the proceedings of the police. Any remains that we discover will be deposited in the mortuary, where you can inspect them to your heart's content. But you can't stay here and watch us." I had no defined object in keeping a watch on the inspector's proceedings, but the sergeant's indiscreet hint had aroused my curiosity, which was further excited by Mr. Badger's evident desire to get rid of me. Moreover, while we had been talking, the pump had stopped, the muddy floor of the pond being now pretty fully exposed, and the inspector's assistant was handling the shovel impatiently. "Now I put it to you, Inspector," I said persuasively, "is it politic of you to allow it to be said that you refused an authorized representative of the family facilities for verifying any statements that you may make hereafter?" "What do you mean?" he asked. "I mean that if you should happen to find some bone which could be identified as part of the body of Mr. Bellingham, that fact would be of more importance to his family than to anyone else. You know that there is a very valuable estate and a rather difficult will." "I didn't know it, and I don't see the bearing of it now." Neither did I, for that matter. "But if you make such a point of being present at the search, I can't very well refuse. Only you mustn't get in our way, that's all." On hearing this conclusion, his assistant, who looked like a plainclothes officer, took up his shovel and stepped into the mud that formed the bottom of the pond, stooping as he went and peering among the masses of weed that had been left stranded by the withdrawal of the water. The inspector watched him anxiously, cautioning him from time to time to look out where he was treading. The laborer left the pump and craned forward from the margin of the mud, and the constable and I looked on from our respective points of vantage. For some time the search was fruitless. Once the searcher stopped and picked up what turned out to be a fragment of decayed wood. Then the remains of a long-deceased jay were discovered, examined, and rejected. Suddenly the man bent down by the side of a small pool that had been left in one of the deeper hollows, stared intently into the mud, and stood up. "There's something here that looks like a bone, sir," he sang out. "Don't grub about, then," said the inspector. "Drive your shovel right into the mud where you saw it, and bring it to the sieve." The man followed out these instructions, and as he came shoreward with a great pile of the slimy mud on his shovel, we all converged on the sieve, which the inspector took up and held over the tub, directing the constable and laborer to lend a hand, meaning thereby that they were to crowd round the tub and exclude me as completely as possible. This, in fact, they did very effectively with his assistance, for, when the shovelful of mud had been deposited on the sieve, the four men leaned over it and so nearly hid it from view that it was only by craning over, first on one side and then on the other, that I was able to catch an occasional glimpse of it and to observe it gradually melting away as the sieve, immersed in the water, was shaken to and fro. Presently the inspector raised the sieve from the water and stooped over it more closely to examine its contents. Apparently the examination yielded no very conclusive results, for it was accompanied by a series of rather dubious grunts. At length the officer stood up, and turning to me with a genial but foxy smile, he held out the sieve for my inspection. "Like to see what we have found, Doctor?" said he. I thanked him and stood over the sieve. It contained the sort of litter of twigs, skeleton leaves, weed, pond snails, dead shells, and freshwater mussels that one would expect to strain out from the mud of an ancient pond. But in addition to these, there were 3 small bones, which at first glance gave me quite a start until I saw what they were. The inspector looked at me inquiringly. Said he. "Yes," I replied, "very interesting." "Those will be human bones, I fancy, "I should say so, undoubtedly," I answered. "Now," said the inspector, "could you say offhand which finger those bones belong to?" I smothered a grin, for I had been expecting this question, and answered, "I can say offhand that they don't belong to any finger. They are the bones of the left great toe." The inspector's jaw dropped. "The deuce they are!" he muttered. "I thought they looked a bit stout." "I expect," said I, "that if you go through the mud close to where this came from, you'll find the rest of the foot." The plain-clothes man proceeded at once to act upon my suggestion, taking the sieve with him to save time. And sure enough, after filling it twice with the mud from the bottom of the pool, the entire skeleton of the foot was brought to light. "Now you're happy, I suppose," said the inspector, when I had checked the bones and found them all present. "I should be more happy," I replied, "if I knew what you were searching for in this pond. You weren't looking for the foot, were you?" "I was looking for anything that I might find," he answered. "I shall go on searching until we have the whole body. I shall go through all the streams and ponds around here, excepting Connaught Water. That I shall leave to the last, as it will be a case of dredging from a boat, and it isn't so likely as the smaller ponds. Perhaps the head will be there. It's deeper than any of the others." It now occurred to me that as I had learned all that I was likely to learn, which was little enough, I might as well leave the inspector to pursue his researches unembarrassed by my presence. Accordingly, I thanked him for his assistance and departed by the way I had come. But as I retraced my steps along the shady path, I speculated profoundly on the officer's proceedings. My examinations of the mutilated hand had yielded the conclusion that the finger had been removed after death or shortly before, but more probably after. Someone else had evidently arrived at the same conclusion and had communicated his opinion to Inspector Badger, for it was clear that the gentleman was in full cry after the missing finger. But why was he searching for it here when the hand had been found at Sidcup? And what did he expect to learn from it when he found it? There is nothing particularly characteristic about a finger, or at least the bones of one, and the object of the present researches was to determine the identity of the person of whom these bones were the remains. There was something mysterious about the affair, something suggesting that Inspector Badger was in possession of private information of some kind. But what information could he have? And whence could he have obtained it? These were questions on which I could find no answer, and I was still fruitlessly revolving them when I arrived at the modest inn where the inquest was to be held, and where I proposed to fortify myself with a correspondingly modest lunch as a preparation for my attendance at the inquiry. End of chapter 12. Chapter 13 of The Eye of Osiris. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Eye of Osiris by R.Austin Freeman. Chapter 13. The Coroner's Quest. The proceedings of that fine old institution, the Coroner's Court, are apt to have their dignity impaired by the somewhat unjudicial surroundings amidst which they are conducted. The present inquiry was to be held in a long room attached to the inn, ordinarily devoted, as its various appurtenances testified, to gatherings of a more convivial character. Hither I betook myself after a protracted lunch and a meditative pipe, and being the first to arrive, the jury having already been sworn and conducted to the mortuary to view the remains, whiled away the time by considering the habits of the customary occupants of the room by the light of the objects contained in it. A wooden target with 1 or 2 darts sticking in it hung on the end wall, and invited the Robin Hoods of the village to try their skill. A system of incised marks on the oaken table made sinister suggestions of shove ha'penny, and a large open box filled with white wigs, gaudily colored robes, and wooden spears, swords, and regalia, crudely coated with gilded paper, obviously appertained to the puerile ceremonials of the Order of Druids. I had exhausted the interest of these relics and had transferred my attentions to the picture gallery when the other spectators and the witnesses began to arrive. Hastily I seated myself in the only comfortable chair beside the one placed at the head of the table, presumably for the coroner, and I had hardly done so when the latter entered accompanied by the jury. Immediately after them came the sergeant, Inspector Badger, 1 or 2 plainclothesmen, and finally the divisional surgeon. The coroner took his seat at the head of the table and opened his book, and the jury seated themselves on a couple of benches on one side of the long table. I looked with some interest at the 12 good men and true. They were a representative group of British tradesmen, quiet, attentive, and rather solemn, but my attention was particularly attracted by a small man with a very large head and a shock of upstanding hair, whom I had diagnosed, after a glance at his intelligent but truculent countenance and the shiny knees of his trousers, as the village cobbler. He sat between the broad-shouldered foreman, who looked like a blacksmith, and a dogged, red-faced man whose general aspect of prosperous greasiness suggested the calling of a butcher. "The inquiry, gentlemen," the coroner commenced, "upon which we are now entering, concerns itself with 2 questions. The first is that of identity. Who was this person whose body we have just viewed? The second is, how, when, and by what means did he come by his death? We will take the identity first, and begin with the circumstances under which the body was discovered." Here the cobbler stood up and raised an excessively dirty hand. "I rise, Mr. Chairman," said he, "to a point of order." The other jurymen looked at him curiously, and some of them, I regret to say, grinned. "You have referred, sir," he continued, "to the body which we have just viewed. I wish to point out that we have not viewed a body, we have viewed a collection of bones." "We will refer to them as the remains, if you prefer it," said the coroner. "I do prefer it," was the reply, and the objector sat down. "Very well," rejoined the coroner, and he proceeded to call the witnesses, of whom the first was a laborer who had discovered the bones in the watercress bed. "Do you happen to know how long it was since the watercress beds had been cleaned out previously?" the coroner asked, when the witness had told the story of the discovery. "They was cleaned out by Mr. Tapper's orders just before he gave 'em up. That will be a little better than 2 years ago. In May it were. I helped to clean 'em. I worked this very same place, and there wasn't no bones there then." The coroner glanced at the jury. "Any questions, gentlemen?" he asked. The cobbler directed an intimidating scowl at the witness and demanded, "Were you searching for bones when you came on these remains?" "Me?" exclaimed the witness. "What should I be searching for bones for?" "Don't prevaricate," said the cobbler sternly. "Answer the question, yes or no." "No, of course I wasn't." The juryman shook his enormous head dubiously, as though implying that he would let it pass this time, but it mustn't happen again, and the examination of the witnesses continued without eliciting anything that was new to me or giving rise to any incident, until the sergeant had described the finding of the right arm in the cuckoo pits. "Was this an accidental discovery?" the coroner asked. "No, we had instructions from Scotland Yard to search any likely pawns in this neighborhood." The coroner discreetly forbore to press this matter any further, but my friend the cobbler was evidently on the qui vive, and I anticipated a brisk cross-examination for Mr. Badger when his turn came. The inspector was apparently of the same opinion, for I saw him cast a glance of the deepest malevolence at the too inquiring disciple of St. Crispin. In fact, his turn came next, and the cobbler's hair stood up with unholy joy. The finding of the lower half of the trunk in Staple's Pond at Loughton was the inspector's own achievement, but he was not boastful about it. The discovery, he remarked, followed naturally on the previous one in the Cuckoo Pits. "Had you any private information that led you to search this particular neighborhood?" the cobbler asked. "We had no private information whatever," replied Badger. "Now I put it to you," pursued the juryman, shaking a forensic and very dirty forefinger at the inspector. "Here are certain remains found at Sidcup. Here are certain other remains found at St. Mary Cray, and certain others at Lee. All those places are in Kent. Now, isn't it very remarkable that you should come straight down to Epping Forest, which is in Essex, and search for those bones and find 'em?" "We were making a systematic search of all likely places," replied Badger. "Exactly," said the cobbler with a ferocious grin. "That's just my point. I say, isn't it very funny that, after finding the remains in Kent some 20 miles from here, with the River Thames between, you should come here to look for the bones, and go straight to Staple's Pond, where they happen to be, and find 'em?" "It would have been more funny," Badger replied sourly, "if we'd gone straight to a place where they happened not to be, and found 'em." A gratified snigger arose from the other 11 good men and true, and the cobbler grinned savagely, but before he could think of a suitable rejoinder, the coroner interposed. "The question is not very material," he said, "and we mustn't embarrass the police by unnecessary inquiries." "It's my belief," said the cobbler, "that he knew they were there all the time." "The witness has stated that he had no private information," said the coroner, and he proceeded to take the rest of the inspector's evidence, watched closely by the critical juror. The account of the finding of the remains having been given in full, the police surgeon was called and sworn. The jurymen straightened their backs with an air of expectancy, and I turned over a page of my notebook. "You have examined the bones at present lying in the mortuary and forming the subject of this inquiry?" the coroner asked. "I have." "Will you kindly tell us what you have observed?" "I find that the bones are human bones, and are, in my opinion, all parts of the same person. They form a skeleton which is complete, with the exception of the skull, the third finger of the left hand, the kneecaps, and the leg bones. I mean the bones between the knees and the ankles." "Is there anything to account for the absence of the missing finger?" "No. There is no deformity and no sign of its having been amputated during life. In my opinion, it was removed after death." "Can you give us any description of the deceased?" "I should say that these are the bones of an elderly man, probably over 60 years of age, about 5 feet 8½ inches in height, of rather stout build, fairly muscular, and well preserved. There are no signs of disease, excepting some old standing rheumatic gout of the right hip joint." "Can you form any opinion as to the cause of death?" "No. There are no marks of violence or signs of injury. But it will be impossible to form any opinion as to the cause of death until we have seen the skull." "Did you note anything else of importance?" "Yes, I was struck by the appearance of anatomical knowledge and skill on the part of the person who dismembered the body. The knowledge of anatomy is proved by the fact that the corpse has been divided into definite anatomical regions. For instance, the bones of the neck are complete and include the top joint of the backbone known as the atlas, whereas a person without anatomical knowledge would probably take off the head by cutting through the neck. Then the arms have been separated with the scapula or shoulder blade, and clavicle or collarbone attached, just as an arm would be removed for dissection. The skill is shown by the neat way in which the dismemberment has been carried out. The parts have not been rudely hacked asunder, but have been separated at the joints so skillfully that I have not discovered a single scratch or mark of the knife on any of the bones." "Can you suggest any class of person who would be likely to possess the knowledge and skill to which you refer?" "It would, of course, be possessed by a surgeon or medical student, and possibly by a butcher." "You think that the person who dismembered this body may have been a surgeon or a medical student?" "Yes, or a butcher. Someone accustomed to the dismemberment of bodies and skillful with the knife." Here the cobbler suddenly rose to his feet. "I rise, Mr. Chairman," said he, "to protest against the statement that has just been made." "What statement?" demanded the coroner. "Against the aspersion," continued the cobbler, with an oratorical flourish, "that has been cast upon an honorable calling." "I don't understand you," said the coroner. "Dr. Summers has insinuated that this murder was committed by a butcher. Now a member of that honorable calling is sitting on this jury." "You let me alone," growled the butcher. "I will not let you alone," persisted the cobbler. "I desire—" Shut up, Pope." This was from the foreman, who at the same moment reached out an enormous hairy hand with which he grabbed the cobbler's coat tails and brought him into a sitting posture with a thump that shook the room. But Mr. Pope, though seated, was not silenced. "I desire," he said, "to have my protest put on record." "I can't do that," said the coroner, "and I can't allow you to interrupt the witnesses." "I am acting," said Mr. Pope, "in the interest of my friend here and the members of an honorable—" But here the butcher turned on him savagely, and in a hoarse stage whisper exclaimed, "Look here, Pope, you've got too much of what the cat licks." "Gentlemen, gentlemen!" the coroner protested sternly, "I cannot permit this unseemly conduct. You are forgetting the solemnity of the occasion and your own responsible positions. I must insist on more decent and decorous behavior." There was profound silence, in the midst of which the butcher concluded in the same hoarse whisper, "Licks her paws with." The coroner cast a withering glance at him, and turning to the witness, resumed the examination. "Can you tell us, doctor, how long a time has elapsed since the death of the deceased?" "I should say not less than 18 months, but probably more. How much more it is impossible, from inspection alone, to say. The bones are perfectly clean, that is, clean of all soft structures, and will remain substantially in their present condition for many years. The evidence of the man who found the remains in the watercress bed suggests that they could not have been there for more than 2 years. Do the appearances, in your opinion, agree with that view?" "Yes, perfectly." "There is one more point, doctor, a very important one. Do you find anything in any of the bones, or all of them together, which would enable you to identify them as the bones of any particular individual?" "No," replied Dr. Summers. "I find no peculiarity which could furnish the means of personal identification." "The description of a missing individual has been given to us," said the coroner. "A man, 59 years of age, 5 feet 8 inches in height, healthy, well preserved, rather broad in build, and having an old Pott's fracture of the left ankle. Do the remains that you have examined agree with that description?" "Yes, so far as agreement is possible. There is no disagreement." "The remains might be those of that individual?" "They might, but there is no positive evidence that they are. The description would apply to a large proportion of elderly men, except as to the fracture." "You found no signs of such a fracture?" "No. Pott's fracture affects the bone called the fibula. That is one of the bones that has not yet been found. So there is no evidence on that point. The left foot was quite normal, but then it would be in any case, unless the fracture had resulted in great deformity." "You estimated the height of the deceased as half an inch greater than that of the missing person. Does that constitute a disagreement?" "No. My estimate is only approximate. As the arms are complete and the legs are not, I have based my calculations on the width across the 2 arms. But measurement of the thigh bones gives the same result. The length of the thigh bones is 1 foot 7 inches and 5/8. "So the deceased might not have been taller than 5 feet 8? "That is so. From 5 feet 8 to 5 feet 9. "Thank you. I think that is all we want to ask you, doctor, unless the jury wish to put any questions." He glanced uneasily at that august body, and instantly the irrepressible Pope rose to the occasion. "About the finger that is missing," said the cobbler, "you say that it was cut off after death?" "That is my opinion." "Now can you tell us why it was cut off?" "No, I cannot." "Oh, come now, Dr. Summers. You must have formed some opinion on the subject." Here the coroner interposed. "The doctor is only concerned with the evidence arising out of the actual examination of the remains. Any personal opinions or conjectures that he may have formed are not evidence, and he must not be asked about them." "But, sir," objected Pope, "we want to know why that finger was cut off. It couldn't have been took off for no reason. May I ask, sir, if the person who is missing had anything peculiar about that finger?" "Nothing is stated to that effect in the written description," replied the coroner. "Perhaps," suggested Pope, "Inspector Badger can tell us." "I think," said the coroner, "we had better not ask the police too many questions. They will tell us anything that they wish to be made public." "Oh, very well," snapped the cobbler. "If it's a matter of hushing it up, I've got no more to say. Only I don't see how we are to arrive at a verdict if we don't have the facts put before us." All the witnesses having now been examined, the coroner proceeded to sum up and address the jury. "You have heard the evidence, gentlemen, of the various witnesses, and you will have perceived that it does not enable us to answer either of the questions that form the subject of this inquiry. We now know that the deceased was an elderly man, about 60 years of age and about 5 feet 8 to 9 in height, and that his death took place from 18 months to 2 years ago. That is all we know. From the treatment to which the body has been subjected, we may form conjectures as to the circumstances of his death, but we have no actual knowledge. We do not know who the deceased was or how he came by his death. Consequently, it will be necessary to adjourn this inquiry until fresh facts are available, and as soon as that is the case, you will receive due notice that your attendance is required." The silence of the court gave place to the confused noise of moving chairs and a general outbreak of eager talk, amidst which I rose and made my way out into the street. At the door I encountered Dr. Summers, whose dog-cart was waiting close by. "Are you going back to town now?" he asked. "Yes," I answered, "as soon as I can catch a train." "If you jump into my cart I'll run you down in time for the 5:1. You'll miss it if you walk." I accepted his offer thankfully, and a minute later was spinning briskly down the road to the station. "Queer little devil, that man Pope," Dr. Summers remarked. "Quite a character. A socialist, laborite, agitator, general crank, anything for a row." "Yes," I answered. "That was what his appearance suggested. It must be trying for the coroner to get a truculent rascal like that on a jury." Summers laughed. "I don't know. He supplies the comic relief. And then, you know, those fellows have their uses. Some of his questions were pretty pertinent." "So Badger seemed to think." "Yes, by Jove," chuckled Summers. "Badger didn't like him a bit, and I suspect the worthy inspector was sailing pretty close to the wind in his answers." "You think he really has some private information?" "Depends on what you mean by 'information.' The police are not a speculative body. They wouldn't be taking all this trouble unless they had a pretty straight tip from somebody. How are Mr. and Miss Bellingham? I used to know them when they lived here." I was considering a discreet answer to this question when we swept into the station yard. At the same moment the train drew up at the platform, and with a hurried handshake and hastily spoken thanks, I sprang from the dog-cart and darted into the station. During the rather slow journey homeward, I read over my notes and endeavored to extract from the facts they set forth some significance other than that which lay on the surface, but without much success. Then I fell to speculating on what Thorndyke would think of the evidence at the inquest, and whether he would be satisfied with the information that I had collected. These speculations lasted me, with occasional digressions, until I arrived at the Temple and ran up the stairs rather eagerly to my friend's chambers. But here a disappointment awaited me. The nest was empty, with the exception of Polton, who appeared at the laboratory door in his white apron with a pair of flat-nosed pliers in his hands. "The doctor had to go down to Bristol and consult over an urgent case," he explained, "and Dr. Jervis has gone with him. They'll be away a day or two, I expect. But the doctor left this note for you." He took a letter from the shelf, where it had been stood conspicuously on edge, and handed it to me. It was a short note from Thorndyke, apologizing for his sudden departure and asking me to give Polton my notes with any comments which I had to make. "You will be interested to learn," he added, "that the application will be heard in the probate court the day after tomorrow. I shall not be present, of course, nor will Jervis, so I should like you to attend and keep your eyes open for anything that may happen during the hearing and that may not appear in the notes that Marchmont's clerk will be instructed to take. I have retained Dr. Payne to stand by and help you with the practice, so that you can attend the court with a clear conscience." This was highly flattering and quite atoned for the small disappointment. With deep gratification at the trust that Thorndyke had reposed in me, I pocketed the letter, handed my notes to Polton, wished him good evening, and betook myself to Fetter Lane. End of Chapter 13. Chapter 14 of The Eye of Osiris. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Eye of Osiris by R.Austin Freeman. Chapter 14, which carries the reader into the probate court. The probate court wore an air of studious repose when I entered with Miss Bellingham and her father. Apparently, the great and inquisitive public had not become aware of the proceedings that were about to take place, or had not realized their connection with the sensational mutilation case, but barristers and pressmen, better informed, had gathered in some strength, and the hum of their conversation filled the air like the droning of the voluntary that ushers in a cathedral service. As we entered, a pleasant-faced elderly gentleman rose and came forward to meet us, shaking Mr. Bellingham's hand cordially and saluting Miss Bellingham with a courtly bow. "That is Mr. Marchmont, doctor," said the former, introducing me, and the solicitor, having thanked me for the trouble I had taken in attending at the inquest, led us to a bench, at the farther end of which was seated a gentleman whom I recognized as Mr. Hurst. Mr. Bellingham recognized him at the same moment and glared at him wrathfully. "I see that scoundrel is here," he exclaimed in a distinctly audible voice, "pretending that he doesn't see me because he is ashamed to look me in the face, but—" "Hush, hush, my dear sir!" exclaimed the horrified solicitor. "We mustn't talk like that, especially in this place. Let me beg you, let me entreat you to control your feelings, to make no indiscreet remarks, in fact, to make no remarks at all," he added, with the evident conviction that any remarks that Mr. Bellingham might make would be certain to be indiscreet. "Forgive me, Marchmont," said Bellingham quite contritely. "I will control myself. I will really be quite discreet. I won't even look at him again, because if I do I shall probably go over and pull his nose." This form of discretion did not appear to be quite to Mr. Marchmont's liking, for he took the precaution of insisting that Miss Bellingham and I should sit on the farther side of his client, and thus effectually separate him from his enemy. "Who's the long-nosed fellow talking to Jellicoe?" Mr. Bellingham asked. "That is Mr. Loram, K.C., Mr. Hurst's counsel, and the convivial-looking gentleman next to him is our counsel, Mr. Heath, a most able man and—" here Mr. Marchmont whispered behind his hand, "fully instructed by Dr. Thorndyke." At this juncture the judge entered and took his seat. The usher proceeded with great rapidity to swear in the jury, and the court gradually settled down into that state of academic quiet which it maintained throughout the proceedings, excepting when the noisy swing doors were set oscillating by some bustling clerk or reporter. The judge was a somewhat singular-looking old gentleman, very short as to his face and very long as to his mouth, which peculiarities, together with a pair of large and bulging eyes, which he usually kept closed, suggested a certain resemblance to a frog. And he had a curious frog-like trick of flattening his eyelids, as if in the act of swallowing a large beetle, which was the only outward and visible sign of emotion that he ever displayed. As soon as the swearing in of the jury was completed, Mr. Loram rose to introduce the case, whereupon his lordship leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes, as if bracing himself for a painful operation. "The present proceedings," Mr. Loram explained, "are occasioned by the unaccountable disappearance of Mr. John Bellingham, of 141 Queen Square, Bloomsbury, which occurred about 2 years ago, or, to be more precise, on the 23rd of November, 1902. Since that date nothing has been heard of Mr. Bellingham, and as there are certain substantial reasons for believing him to be dead, the principal beneficiary under his will, Mr. George Hurst, is now applying to the court for permission to presume the death of the testator and prove the will. As the time which has elapsed since the testator was last seen alive is only 2 years, the application is based upon the circumstances of the disappearance, which were, in many respects, very singular. The most remarkable feature of that disappearance being, perhaps, its suddenness and completeness." Here the judge remarked in a still, small voice that it would, perhaps, have been even more remarkable if the testator had disappeared gradually and incompletely. "No doubt, my lord," agreed Mr. Loram. "But the point is that the testator, whose habits had always been regular and orderly, disappeared on the date mentioned without having made any of the usual provisions for the conduct of his affairs, and has not since then been seen or heard of." With this preamble, Mr. Loram proceeded to give a narrative of the events connected with the disappearance of John Bellingham, which was substantially identical with that which I had read in the newspapers, and having laid the actual facts before the jury, he went on to discuss their probable import. "Now, what conclusion," he asked, "will this strange, this most mysterious train of events suggest to an intelligent person who shall consider it impartially? Here is a man who steps forth from the house of his cousin or his brother, as the case may be, and forthwith, in the twinkling of an eye, vanishes from human ken. What is the explanation? Did he steal forth, and without notice or hint of his intention, take train to some seaport, thence to embark for some distant land, leaving his affairs to take care of themselves, and his friends to speculate vainly as to his whereabouts? Is he now hiding abroad, or even at home, indifferent alike to the safety of his own considerable property and the peace of mind of his friends? Or is it that death has come upon him unawares, by sickness, by accident, or, more probably, by the hand of some unknown criminal? Let us consider the probabilities. Can he have disappeared by his own deliberate act? Why not, it may be asked. Men undoubtedly do disappear from time to time, to be discovered by chance, or to reappear voluntarily after intervals of years, and find their names almost forgotten and their places filled by newcomers. Yes, but there is always some reason for a disappearance of this kind, even though it be a bad one. Family discords make life a weariness. Pecuniary difficulties make life a succession of anxieties. Distaste for particular circumstances and surroundings from which there seems no escape, inherent restlessness and vagabond tendencies, and so on. Do any of these explanations apply to the present case? No, they do not. Family discords, at least those capable of producing chronic misery, appertain exclusively to a married state, but the testator was a bachelor, with no encumbrances whatever. Pecuniary anxieties can be equally excluded. The testator was in easy, in fact, in affluent circumstances. His mode of life was apparently agreeable and full of interest and activity, and he had full liberty of change if he wished. He had been accustomed to travel, and could do so again without absconding. He had reached an age when radical changes do not seem desirable. He was a man of fixed and regular habits, and his regularity was of his own choice, and not due to compulsion or necessity. When last seen by his friends, as I shall prove, he was proceeding to a definite destination with the expressed intention of returning for purposes of his own appointing. He did return, and then vanished, leaving those purposes unachieved. If we conclude that he has voluntarily disappeared and is at present in hiding, we adopt an opinion that is entirely at variance with all these weighty facts. If, on the other hand, we conclude that he has died suddenly, or has been killed by an accident or otherwise, we are adopting a view that involves no inherent improbabilities, and that is entirely congruous with the known facts. Facts that will be proved by the testimony of the witnesses whom I shall call. The supposition that the testator is dead is not only more probable than that he is alive. I submit it is the only reasonable explanation of the circumstances of his disappearance. But this is not all. The presumption of death which arises so inevitably out of the mysterious and abrupt manner in which the testator disappeared has recently received most conclusive and dreadful confirmation. On the 15th of July last there were discovered at Sidcup the remains of a human arm, a left arm, gentlemen, from the hand of which the third, or ring finger, was missing. The doctor who has examined that arm will tell you that the finger was cut off either after death or immediately before. His evidence will prove conclusively that the arm must have been deposited in the place where it was found just about the time when the testator disappeared. Since that first discovery, other portions of the same mutilated body have come to light, and it is a strange and significant fact that they have all been found in the immediate neighborhood of Eltham or Woodford. You will remember, gentlemen, that it was either at Eltham or Woodford that the testator was last seen alive. And now observe the completeness of the coincidence. These human remains, as you will be told presently by the experienced and learned medical gentleman who has examined them most exhaustively, are those of a man of about 60 years of age, about 5 feet 8 inches in height, fairly muscular and well preserved, apparently healthy and rather stoutly built. Another witness will tell you that the missing man was about 60 years of age, about 5 feet 8 inches in height, fairly muscular and well preserved, apparently healthy, and rather stoutly built. And, another most significant and striking fact, the testator was accustomed to wear upon the third finger of his left hand, the very finger that is missing from the remains that were found, a most peculiar ring, which fitted so tightly that he was unable to get it off after once putting it on, a ring, gentlemen, of so peculiar a pattern that had it been found on the body must have instantly established the identity of the remains. In a word, gentlemen, the remains which have been found are those of a man exactly like the testator. They differ from him in no respects whatever. They display a mutilation which suggests an attempt to conceal an identifying peculiarity which he undoubtedly presented, and they were deposited in their various hiding places about the time of the testator's disappearance. Accordingly, when you have heard these facts, proved by the sworn testimony of competent witnesses, together with the facts relating to the disappearance, I shall ask you for a verdict in accordance with that evidence." Mr. Loram sat down, and adjusting a pair of pince-nez, rapidly glanced over his brief while the usher was administering the oath to the first witness. This was Mr. Jellicoe, who stepped into the box and directed a stony gaze at the apparently unconscious judge. The usual preliminaries having been gone through, Mr. Loram proceeded to examine him. "You were the testator's solicitor and confidential agent, I believe?" "I was, and am." "How long have you known him?" 27 years. "Judging from your experience of him, should you say that he was a person likely to disappear voluntarily and suddenly to cease to communicate with his friends?" "No." "Kindly give your reasons for that opinion." "Such conduct on the part of the testator would be entirely opposed to his habits and character as they are known to me. He was exceedingly regular and businesslike in his dealings with me. When traveling abroad, he always kept me informed as to his whereabouts, or, if he was likely to be beyond reach of communication, he always advised me beforehand. One of my duties was to collect a pension which he drew from the Foreign Office, and on no occasion, previous to his disappearance, has he ever failed to furnish me punctually with the necessary documents." "Had he, so far as you know, any reasons for wishing to disappear?" "No." "When and where did you last see him alive?" "At 6 o'clock in the evening, on the 14th of October, 1902, at 141 Queen Square, Bloomsbury." "Kindly tell us what happened on that occasion." "The testator had called for me at my office at 3:15, and asked me to come with him to his house to meet Dr. Norbury. I accompanied him to 141 Queen Square, and shortly after we arrived, Dr. Norbury came to look at some antiquities that the testator proposed to give to the British Museum. The gift consisted of a mummy and 4 canopic jars and other tomb furniture, which the testator stipulated should be exhibited together in a single case, and in the state in which they were then presented. Of these objects, the mummy only was ready for inspection. The tomb furniture had not yet arrived in England, but was expected within a week. Dr. Norbury accepted the gift on behalf of the museum, but could not take possession of the objects until he had communicated with the director and obtained his formal authority. The testator accordingly gave me certain instructions concerning the delivery of the gift, as he was leaving England that evening." "Are those instructions relevant to the subject of this inquiry?" "I think they are. The testator was going to Paris, and perhaps from thence to Vienna. He instructed me to receive and unpack the tomb furniture on its arrival, and to store it, with the mummy, in a particular room, where it was to remain for 3 weeks. If he returned within that time, he was to hand it over in person to the museum authorities. If he had not returned within that time, he desired me to notify the museum authorities that they were at liberty to take possession of and remove the collection at their convenience. From these instructions I gathered that the testator was uncertain as to the length of his absence from England and the extent of his journey." "Did he state precisely where he was going?" "No. He said he was going to Paris and perhaps to Vienna, but he gave no particulars, and I asked for none." "Do you, in fact, know where he went?" "No." He left the house at 6 o'clock, wearing a long, heavy overcoat, and carrying a suitcase and an umbrella. I wished him good-bye at the door, and watched him walk away as if going toward Southampton Row. I have no idea where he went, and I never saw him again." "Had he no other luggage than the suitcase?" "I don't know, but I believe not. He was accustomed to travel with the bare necessaries, and to buy anything further he wanted en route." "Did he say anything to the servants as to the probable date of his return?" "There were no servants excepting the caretaker. The house was not used for residential purposes. The testator slept and took his meals at his club, though he kept his clothes at the house." "Did you receive any communication from him after he left?" "No. I never heard from him again in any way. I waited for 3 weeks, as he had instructed me, and then notified the museum authorities that the collection was ready for removal. 5 days later, Dr. Norbury came and took formal possession of it, and it was transferred to the museum forthwith." "When did you next hear of the testator?" "On the 23rd of November following, at 7:15 in the evening. Mr. George Hurst came to my rooms, which are over my office, and informed me that the testator had called at his house during his absence, and had been shown into the study to wait for him. That on his, Mr. Hurst's, arrival, it was found that the testator had disappeared, without acquainting the servants of his intended departure, and without being seen by anyone to leave the house. Mr. Hurst thought this so remarkable that he had hastened up to town to inform me. I also thought it a remarkable circumstance, especially as I had received no communication from the testator, and we both decided that it was advisable to inform the testator's brother, Godfrey, of what had happened. Accordingly, Mr. Hurst and I proceeded as quickly as possible to Liverpool Street, and took the first train available to Woodford, where Mr. Godfrey Bellingham then resided. We arrived at his house at 5 minutes to 9, and were informed by the servant that he was not at home, but that his daughter was in the library, which was a detached building situated in the grounds. The servant lighted a lantern and conducted us through the grounds to the library, where we found Mr. Godfrey Bellingham and Miss Bellingham. Mr. Godfrey had only just come in, and had entered by the back gate, which had a bell that rang in the library. Mr. Hurst informed Mr. Godfrey of what had occurred, and then we left the library to walk up to the house. A few paces from the library, I noticed by the light of the lantern, which Mr. Godfrey was carrying, a small object lying on the lawn. I pointed it out to him, and he picked it up, and then we all recognized it as a scarab that the testator was accustomed to wear on his watch chain. It was fitted with a gold wire, passed through the suspension hole, and a gold ring. Both the wire and the ring were in position, but the ring was broken. We went to the house and questioned the servants as to visitors, but none of them had seen the testator, and they all agreed that no visitor whatsoever had come to the house during the afternoon or evening. Mr. Godfrey and Miss Bellingham both declared that they had neither seen nor heard anything of the testator, and were both unaware that he had returned to England. As the circumstances were somewhat disquieting, I communicated on the following morning with the police, and requested them to make inquiries, which they did, with the result that a suitcase bearing the initials J.B. was found to be lying unclaimed in the cloakroom at Charing Cross Station. I was able to identify the suitcase as that which I had seen the testator carry away from Queen Square. I was also able to identify some of the contents. I interviewed the cloakroom attendant, who informed me that the suitcase had been deposited on the 23rd about 4:15 p.m. He had no recollection of the person who deposited it. It remained unclaimed in the possession of the railway company for 3 months, and was then surrendered to me. Were there any marks or labels on it showing the route by which it had traveled? There were no labels on it, and no marks other than the initials J.B. Do you happen to know the testator's age? Yes, he was 59 on the 11th of October, 1902. Can you tell us what his height was? Yes, he was exactly 5 feet 8 inches. What sort of health had he? So far as I know, his health was good. I am not aware that he suffered from any disease. I am only judging by his appearance, which was that of a healthy man." "Should you describe him as well preserved or otherwise?" "I should describe him as a well preserved man for his age." "How should you describe his figure?" "I should describe him as rather broad and stout in build, and fairly muscular, though not exceptionally so." Mr. Loram made a rapid note of these answers, and then said, "You have told us, Mr. Jellicoe, that you have known the testator intimately for 27 years. Now, did you ever notice whether he was accustomed to wear any rings upon his fingers?" "He wore upon the third finger of his left hand a copy of an antique ring which bore the device of the Eye of Osiris. That was the only ring he ever wore, as far as I know." "Did he wear it constantly?" "Yes, necessarily, because it was too small for him, and having once squeezed it on, he was never able to get it off again." This was the sum of Mr. Jellicoe's evidence, and at its conclusion the witness glanced inquiringly at Mr. Bellingham's counsel. But Mr. Heath remained seated, attentively considering the notes that he had just made, and, finding that there was to be no cross-examination, Mr. Jellicoe stepped down from the box. I leaned back on my bench, and turning my head, observed Miss Bellingham deep in thought. "What do you think of it?" I asked. "It seems very complete and conclusive," she replied. And then, with a sigh, she murmured, "Poor old Uncle John! How horrid it sounds to talk of him in this cold-blooded, business-like way, as the testator, as if he were nothing but an algebraical sign." "There isn't much room for sentiment, I suppose, in the proceedings of the probate court," I replied, to which she assented, and then asked, "Who is this lady?" This lady was a fashionably dressed young woman who had just bounced into the witness box and was now being sworn. The preliminaries being finished, she answered Miss Bellingham's question and Mr. Loram's by stating that her name was Augustina Gwendoline Dobbs, and that she was housemaid to Mr. George Hurst of the Poplars, Eltham. "Mr. Hurst lives alone, I believe?" said Mr. Loram. "I don't know what you mean by that," Miss Dobbs began, but the barrister explained. "I mean that I believe he is unmarried." "Well, and what about it?" the witness demanded tartly. "I am asking you a question." "I know that," said the witness viciously, "and I say that you've no business to make any such insinuations to a respectable young lady when there's a cook housekeeper and a kitchen maid living in the house, and him old enough to be my father." Here his lordship flattened his eyelids with startling effect, and Mr. Loram interrupted. "I make no insinuations. I merely ask, is your employer, Mr. Hurst, an unmarried man, or is he not?" "I never asked him," said the witness sulkily. "Please answer my question, yes or no." "How can I answer your question? He may be married, or he may not. How do I know? I'm no private detective." Mr. Loram directed a stupefied gaze at the witness, and in the ensuing silence a plaintive voice came from the bench. "Is that point material?" "Certainly, my lord," replied Mr. Loram. "Then, as I see that you are calling Mr. Hurst, perhaps you had better put the question to him. He will probably know." Mr. Loram bowed, and as the judge subsided into his normal state of coma, he turned to the triumphant witness. "Do you remember anything remarkable occurring on the 23rd of November, the year before last?" "Yes. Mr. John Bellingham called at our house." "How did you know he was Mr. John Bellingham?" "I didn't, but he said he was, and I supposed he knew." "At what time did he arrive?" "At 20 minutes past 5 in the evening." "What happened then?" "I told him that Mr. Hurst had not come home yet, and he said he would wait for him in the study and write some letters. So I showed him into the study and shut the door." "What happened next?" "Nothing. Then Mr. Hurst came home at his usual time, at 5:45, and let himself in with his key. He went straight into the study, where I supposed Mr. Bellingham still was, so I took no notice, but laid the table for 2. At 6 o'clock Mr. Hurst came into the dining room. He has tea in the city and dines at 6, and when he saw the table laid for 2, he asked the reason. I said I thought Mr. Bellingham was staying to dinner. 'Mr. Bellingham,' says he, 'I didn't know he was here. Why didn't you tell me?' he says. 'I thought he was with you, sir,' I said. I showed him into the study, I said. Well, he wasn't there when I came in, he said, and he isn't there now, he said. Perhaps he has gone to wait in the drawing room, he said. So he went and looked in the drawing room, but he wasn't there. Then Mr. Hurst said he thought Mr. Bellingham must have got tired of waiting and gone away. But I told him I was quite sure he hadn't, because I had been watching all the time. Then he asked me if Mr. Bellingham was alone or whether his daughter was with him, and I said that it wasn't Mr. Bellingham at all, but Mr. John Bellingham, and then he was more surprised than ever. I said we had better search the house to make sure whether he was there or not, and Mr. Hurst said he would come with me. So we went all over the house and looked in all the rooms, but there was not a sign of Mr. Bellingham in any of them. Then Mr. Hurst got very nervous and upset, and when he had just snatched a little dinner, he ran off to catch the 6:31 train up to town. You say Mr. Bellingham could not have left the house because you were watching all the time. Where were you while you were watching? I was in the kitchen. I could see the front gate from the kitchen window. You say that you laid the table for two. Where did you lay it? In the dining room, of course. Could you see the front gate from the dining room? No, but I could see the study door. The study is opposite the dining room. Do you have to come upstairs to get from the kitchen to the dining room? Yes, of course you do. Then might not Mr. Bellingham have left the house while you were coming up the stairs? No, he couldn't have done. Why not? Because it would have been impossible. But why would it have been impossible? Because he couldn't have done it. I suggest that Mr. Bellingham left the house quietly while you were on the stairs. No, he didn't. How do you know he did not? I am quite sure he didn't. But how can you be certain? Because I would have seen him if he had. But I mean while you were on the stairs. He was in the study while I was on the stairs. How do you know he was in the study? Because I showed him in there, and he hadn't come out. Mr. Loram paused and took a deep breath, and his lordship flattened his eyelids. Is there a side gate to the premises? The barrister resumed wearily. Yes, it opens into a narrow lane at the side of the house. And there is a French window in the study, is there not? Yes, it opens onto the small grass plot opposite the side gate. The window and the gate both have catches on the inside. Could it have been possible for Mr. Bellingham to let himself out into the lane? The window and the gate both have catches on the inside. He could have got out that way, but of course he didn't. Why not? Well, no gentleman would go creeping out the back way like a thief. Did you look to see if the French window was shut and fastened after you missed Mr. Bellingham? I looked at it when we shut the house up for the night. It was then shut and fastened on the inside. And the side gate? That gate was shut and latched. You have to slam the gate to make the latch fasten, so no one could have gone out of the gate without being heard. Here the examination in chief ended, and Mr. Loram sat down with an audible sigh of relief. Miss Dobbs was about to step down from the witness box when Mr. Heath rose to cross-examine. "Did you see Mr. Bellingham in a good light?" he asked. "Pretty good. It was dark outside, but the hall lamp was alight." "Kindly look at this." Here a small object was passed across to the witness. "It is a trinket that Mr. Bellingham is stated to have carried suspended from his watch guard. Can you remember if he was wearing it in that manner when he came to the house?" "No, he was not." "You are quite sure of that?" "Quite sure." "Thank you. And now I want to ask you about the search that you have mentioned. You say that you went all over the house. Did you go into the study?" "No, at least not until Mr. Hurst had gone to London." "When you did go in, was the window fastened?" "Yes." "Could it have been fastened from the outside?" "No, there's no handle outside." "What furniture is there in the study?" "There is a writing table, a revolving chair, 2 easy chairs, 2 large bookcases, and a wardrobe that Mr. Hurst keeps his overcoats and hats in." "Does the wardrobe lock?" "Yes." "Was it locked when you went in?" "I'm sure I don't know. I don't go about trying the cupboards and drawers." "What furniture is there in the drawing room?" "A cabinet, 6 or 7 chairs, a Chesterfield sofa, a piano, a silver table, and 1 or 2 occasional tables." "Is the piano a grand or an upright?" "It's an upright grand." "In what position is it placed?" "It stands across the corner near the window." "Is there sufficient room behind it for a man to conceal himself?" Miss Dobbs was amused and did not dissemble. "Oh, yes," she sniggered. "There's plenty of room for a man to hide behind it." "When you searched the drawing-room, did you look behind the piano?" "No, I didn't," Miss Dobbs replied scornfully. "Did you look under the sofa?" "Certainly not." "What did you do then?" "We opened the door and looked into the room. We were not looking for a cat or a monkey. We were looking for a middle-aged gentleman." "And am I to take it that your search over the rest of the house was conducted in a similar manner?" "Certainly. We looked into the rooms, but we did not search under the beds or in the cupboards." "Are all the rooms in the house in use as living or sleeping rooms?" "No. There is one room on the second floor that is used as a store and lumber room, and one on the first floor that Mr. Hurst uses to store trunks and things that he is not using." "Did you look in those rooms when you searched the house?" "No." "Have you looked in them since?" "I have been in the lumber room since, but not in the other. It is always kept locked." At this point an ominous flattening became apparent in his lordship's eyelids, but these symptoms passed when Mr. Heath sat down and indicated that he had no further questions to ask. Miss Dobbs once more prepared to step down from the witness box, when Mr. Loram shot up like a jack-in-the-box. "You have made certain statements," said he, "concerning the scarab which Mr. Bellingham was accustomed to wear suspended from his watch-guard. You say that he was not wearing it when he came to Mr. Hurst's house on the 23rd of November, 1902. Are you quite sure of that?" "Quite sure." "I must ask you to be very careful in your statement on this point. The question is a highly important one. Do you swear that the scarab was not hanging from his watch-guard?" "Yes, I do." "Did you notice the watch-guard particularly?" "No, not particularly." "Then what makes you sure that the scarab was not attached to it?" "It couldn't have been." "Why could it not?" "Because if it had been there, I should have seen it." "What kind of watch-guard was Mr. Bellingham wearing?" "Oh, an ordinary sort of watch-guard." "I mean, was it a chain, or a ribbon, or a strap?" "A chain, I think, or perhaps a ribbon, or it might have been a strap." His lordship flattened his eyelids, but made no further sign, and Mr. Loram continued. "Did you or did you not notice what kind of watch-guard Mr. Bellingham was wearing?" "I did not. Why should I? It was no business of mine." "But yet you are quite sure about the scarab?" "Yes, quite sure." "You noticed that, then?" "No, I didn't. How could I, when it wasn't there?" Mr. Loram paused and looked helplessly at the witness. A suppressed titter arose from the body of the court, and a faint voice from the bench inquired, "Are you quite incapable of giving a straightforward answer?" Miss Dobbs' only reply was to burst into tears, whereupon Mr. Loram abruptly sat down and abandoned his re-examination. The witness box vacated by Miss Dobbs was occupied successively by Dr. Norbury, Mr. Hurst, and the cloakroom attendant, none of whom contributed any new facts, but merely corroborated the statements made by Mr. Jellicoe and the housemaid. Then came the laborer who discovered the bones at Sidcup, and who repeated the evidence that he had given at the inquest, showing that the remains could not have been lying in the watercress bed more than 2 years. Finally, Dr. Summers was called, and after he had given a brief description of the bones that he had examined, was asked by Mr. Loram, "You have heard the description that Mr. Jellicoe has given of the testator?" "I have." "Does that description apply to the person whose remains you examined?" "In a general way, it does." "I must ask you for a direct answer. Yes or no. Does it apply?" "Yes. But I ought to say that my estimate of the height of the deceased is only approximate." "Quite so. Judging from your examination of those remains and from Mr. Jellicoe's description, might those remains be the remains of the testator, John Bellingham?" "Yes, they might." On receiving this admission, Mr. Loram sat down, and Mr. Heath immediately rose to cross-examine. "When you examined the remains, Dr. Summers, did you discover any personal peculiarities which would enable you to identify them as the remains of any one individual rather than any other individual of similar size, age, and proportions?" "No. I found nothing that would identify the remains as those of any particular individual." As Mr. Heath asked no further questions, the witness received his dismissal, and Mr. Loram informed the court that that was his case. The judge bowed somnolently, And then Mr. Heath rose to address the court on behalf of the respondent. It was not a long speech, nor was it enriched by any displays of florid rhetoric. It concerned itself exclusively with a rebutment of the arguments of the counsel for the petitioner. Having briefly pointed out that the period of absence was too short to give rise of itself to the presumption of death, Mr. Heath continued. The claim therefore rests upon evidence of a positive character. My learned friend asserts that the testator is presumably dead, and it is for him to prove what he has affirmed. Now, has he done this? I submit that he has not. He has argued with great force and ingenuity that the testator, being a bachelor, a solitary man without wife or child, dependent or master, public or private office of duty, or any bond, responsibility, or any other condition limiting his freedom of action, had no reason or inducement for absconding. This is my learned friend's argument, and he has conducted it with so much skill and ingenuity that he has not only succeeded in proving his case, he has proved a great deal too much. For if it is true, as my learned friend so justly argues, that a man thus unfettered by obligations of any kind has no reason for disappearing, is it not even more true that he has no reason for not disappearing? My friend has urged that the testator was at liberty to go where he pleased, when he pleased, and how he pleased, and that therefore there was no need for him to abscond. I reply, if he was at liberty to go away, whither, when, and how he pleased, why do we express surprise that he has made use of his liberty? My learned friend points out that the testator notified nobody of his intention of going away, and has acquainted no one with his whereabouts. But, I ask, whom should he have notified? He was responsible to nobody. There was no one dependent upon him. His presence or absence was the concern of nobody but himself. If circumstances suddenly arising made it desirable that he should go abroad, why should he not go? I say there was no reason whatever. My learned friend has said that the testator went away, leaving his affairs to take care of themselves. Now, gentlemen, I ask you if this can fairly be said of a man whose affairs are, as they have been for many years, in the hands of a highly capable, completely trustworthy agent who is better acquainted with them than the testator himself. Clearly, it cannot. To conclude this part of the argument, I submit that the circumstances of the so-called disappearance of the testator present nothing out of the ordinary. The testator is a man of ample means, without any responsibilities to fetter his movements, and has been in the constant habit of traveling, often into remote and distant regions. The mere fact that he has been absent somewhat longer than usual affords no ground whatever for the drastic proceeding of presumption of death and taking possession of his property. With reference to the human remains which have been mentioned in connection with the case, I need say but little. The attempt to connect them with the testator has failed completely. You yourselves have heard Dr. Summers state on oath that they cannot be identified as the remains of any particular person. That would seem to dispose of them effectually. I must remark upon a very singular point that has been raised by the learned counsel for the petitioner, which is this. My learned friend points out that these remains were discovered near Eltham and near Woodford, and that the testator was last seen alive at one of these two places. This he considers for some reason to be a highly significant fact, but I cannot agree with him. If the testator had been last seen alive at Woodford, and the remains had been found at Woodford, or if he had disappeared from Eltham and the remains had been found at Eltham, that would have had some significance. But he can only have been last seen at one of the places, whereas the remains have been found at both places. Here again, my learned friend seems to have proved too much. But I need not occupy your time further. I repeat that, in order to justify us in presuming the death of the testator, clear and positive evidence would be necessary. No such evidence has been brought forward. Accordingly, seeing that the testator may return at any time and is entitled to find his property intact, I shall ask you for a verdict that will secure to him this measure of ordinary justice. At the conclusion of Mr. Heath's speech, the judge, as if awakening from a refreshing nap, opened his eyes, and uncommonly shrewd, intelligent eyes they were when the expressive eyelids were duly tucked up out of the way. He commenced by reading over a part of the will and certain notes, which he appeared to have made in some miraculous fashion with his eyes shut, and then proceeded to review the evidence and the counsel's arguments for the instruction of the jury. "Before considering the evidence which you have heard, gentlemen," he said, it will be well for me to say a few words to you on the general aspects of the case which is occupying our attention. If a person goes abroad, or disappears from his home and his ordinary places of resort, and is absent for a long period of time, the presumption of death arises at the expiration of 7 years from the date on which he was last heard of. That is to say, that the total disappearance of an individual for 7 years constitutes presumptive evidence that the said individual is dead, and the presumption can be set aside only by the production of evidence that he was alive at some time within that period of 7 years. But if, on the other hand, it is sought to presume the death of a person who has been absent for a shorter period than 7 years, it is necessary to produce such evidence as shall make it highly probable that the said person is dead. Of course, presumption implies supposition as opposed to actual demonstration, but nevertheless, the evidence in such a case must be of a kind that tends to create a very strong belief that death has occurred, and I need hardly say that the shorter the period of absence, the more convincing must be the evidence. In the present case, the testator, John Bellingham, has been absent somewhat under 2 years. This is a relatively short period, and in itself gives rise to no presumption of death. Nevertheless, death has been presumed in a case where this period of absence was even shorter and the insurance recovered. But here the evidence supporting the belief in the occurrence of death was exceedingly weighty. The testator in this case was a shipmaster, and his disappearance was accompanied by the disappearance of the ship and the entire ship's company in the course of a voyage from London to Marseille. The loss of the ship and her crew was the only reasonable explanation of the disappearance, and, short of actual demonstration, the facts offered convincing evidence of the death of all persons on board. I mention this case as an illustration. You are not dealing with speculative probabilities. You are contemplating a very momentous proceeding, and you must be very sure of your ground. Consider what it is that you are asked to do. The petitioner asks permission to presume the death of the testator in order that the testator's property may be distributed among the beneficiaries under the will. The granting of such permission involves us in the gravest responsibility. An ill-considered decision might be productive of a serious injustice to the testator, an injustice that could never be remedied. Hence it is incumbent upon you to weigh the evidence with the greatest care, to come to no decision without the profoundest consideration of all the facts. The evidence that you have heard divides itself into 2 parts, that relating to the circumstances of the testator's disappearance, and that relating to certain human remains. In connection with the latter, I can only express my surprise and regret that the application was not postponed until the completion of the coroner's inquest, and leave you to consider the evidence. You will bear in mind that Dr. Summers has stated explicitly that the remains cannot be identified as those of any particular individual, but that the testator and the unknown deceased had so many points of resemblance that they might possibly be one and the same person. With reference to the circumstances of the disappearance, you have heard the evidence of Mr. Jellicoe to the effect that the testator has on no previous occasion gone abroad without informing him as to his proposed destination. But in considering what weight you are to give to this statement, you will bear in mind that when the testator set out for Paris after his interview with Dr. Norbury, he left Mr. Jellicoe without any information as to his specific destination, his address in Paris, or the precise date when he should return, and that Mr. Jellicoe was unable to tell us where the testator went or what was his business. Mr. Jellicoe was, in fact, for a time, without any means of tracing the testator or ascertaining his whereabouts. The evidence of the housemaid, Dobbs, and Mr. Hurst is rather confusing. It appears that the testator came to the house, and when looked for later was not to be found. A search of the premises showed that he was not in the house, whence it seems to follow that he must have left it. But since no one was informed of his intention to leave, and he had expressed the intention of staying to see Mr. Hurst, his conduct in thus going away surreptitiously must appear somewhat eccentric. The point that you have to consider, therefore, is whether a person who is capable of thus departing in a surreptitious and eccentric manner from a house, without giving notice to the servants, is capable also of departing in a surreptitious and eccentric manner from his usual places of resort, without giving any notice to his friends or thereafter informing them of his whereabouts. The questions, then, gentlemen, that you have to ask yourselves before deciding on your verdict are two. First, are the circumstances of the testator's disappearance and his continued absence incongruous with his habits and personal peculiarities as they are known to you? And, second, are there any facts which indicate in a positive manner that the testator is dead? Ask yourselves these questions, gentlemen, and the answers to them, furnished by the evidence that you have heard, will guide you to your decision. Having delivered himself of the above instructions, the judge applied himself to the perusal of the will with professional gusto, in which occupation he was presently disturbed by the announcement of the foreman of the jury that a verdict had been agreed upon. The judge sat up and glanced at the jury box, and when the foreman proceeded to state that "we find no sufficient reason for presuming the testator, John Bellingham, to be dead," he nodded approvingly. Evidently that was his opinion, too, as he was careful to explain when he conveyed to Mr. Loram the refusal of the court to grant the permission applied for. The decision was a great relief to me, and also, I think, to Miss Bellingham, but most of all to her father, who, with instinctive good manners, since he could not suppress a smile of triumph, rose and hastily stumped out of the court, so that the discomfited Hurst should not see him. His daughter and I followed, and as we left the court, she remarked with a smile, "So our pauperism is not, after all, made absolute. There is still a chance for us in the chapter of accidents, and perhaps even for poor old Uncle John." End of chapter 14. Chapter 15 of The Eye of Osiris. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Eye of Osiris by R.Austin Freeman. Chapter 15. Circumstantial Evidence. The morning after the hearing saw me setting forth on my round in more than usually good spirits. The round itself was but a short one, for my list contained only a couple of chronics, and this perhaps contributed to my cheerful outlook on life. But there were other reasons. The decision of the court had come as an unexpected reprieve, and the ruin of my friend's prospects was at least postponed. Then I had learned that Thorndyke was back from Bristol and wished me to look in on him. And finally, Miss Bellingham had agreed to spend this very afternoon with me, browsing round the galleries at the British Museum. I had disposed of my two patients by 11:15, and 3 minutes later was striding down Mitre Court, all agog to hear what Thorndyke had to say with reference to my notes on the inquest. The oak was open when I arrived at his chambers, and a modest flourish on the little brass knocker of the inner door was answered by my quondam teacher himself. "How good of you, Berkeley," he said, shaking hands genially, "to look me up so early. I am alone, just looking through the report of the evidence of yesterday's proceedings." He placed an easy chair for me, and gathering up a bundle of typewritten papers, laid them aside on the table. "Were you surprised at the decision?" I asked. "No," he answered. 2 years is a short period of absence, but still, it might easily have gone the other way. I am greatly relieved. The respite gives us time to carry out our investigations without undue hurry." "Did you find my notes of any use?" I asked. "He did. Polton handed them to him, and they were invaluable to him for his cross-examination. I haven't seen them yet. In fact, I have only just got them back from him. Let us go through them together now." He opened a drawer and, taking from it my notebook, seated himself and began to read through my notes with grave attention, while I stood and looked shyly over his shoulder. On the page that contained my sketches of the Sidcup arm, showing the distribution of the snail's eggs on the bones, he lingered with a faint smile that made me turn hot and red. "Those sketches look rather footy," I said, but I had to put something in my notebook. "You did not attach any importance, then, to the facts that they illustrated?" "No. The egg patches were there, so I noted the fact. That's all." "I congratulate you, Berkeley. There is not one man in 20 who would have had the sense to make a careful note of what he considers an unimportant or irrelevant fact, and the investigator who notes only those things that appear significant is perfectly useless. He gives himself no material for reconsideration. But you don't mean that these egg patches and worm tubes appear to you to have no significance at all?" "Oh, of course, they show the position in which the bones were lying." "Exactly. The arm was lying, fully extended, with the dorsal side uppermost. But we also learn from these egg patches that the hand had been separated from the arm before it was thrown into the pond, and there is something very remarkable in that." I leaned over his shoulder and gazed at my sketches, amazed at the rapidity with which he had reconstructed the limb from my rough drawings of the individual bones. "I don't quite see how you arrived at it, though," I said. "Well, look at your drawings. The egg patches are on the dorsal surface of the scapula, the humerus, and the bones of the forearm. But here you have shown 6 of the bones of the hand, 2 metacarpals, the os magnum, and 3 phalanges, and they all have the egg patches on the palmar surface. Therefore, the hand was lying palm upward." "But the hand may have been pronated." "If you mean pronated in relation to the arm, that is impossible, for the position of the egg patches shows clearly that the bones of the arm are lying in the position of supination. Thus the dorsal surface of the arm and the palmar surface of the hand, respectively, were uppermost, which is an anatomical impossibility so long as the hand is attached to the arm." "But might not the hand have become detached after lying in the pond for some time?" "No, it could not have been detached until the ligaments had decayed, and if it had been separated after the decay of the soft parts, the bones would have been thrown into disorder. But the egg patches are all on the palmar surface, showing that the bones were still in their normal relative positions. No, Berkeley, that hand was thrown into the pond separately from the arm." "But why should it have been?" I asked. "Ah, there is a very pretty little problem for you to consider. And meantime, let me tell you that your expedition has been a brilliant success. You are an excellent observer. Your only fault is that when you have noted certain facts, you don't seem fully to appreciate their significance, which is merely a matter of inexperience. As to the facts that you have collected, several of them are of prime importance." "I am glad you are satisfied," said I, "though I don't see that I have discovered much excepting those snails' eggs, and they don't seem to have advanced matters much." "A definite fact, Berkeley, is a definite asset. Perhaps we may presently find a little space in our Chinese puzzle which this fact of the detached hand will just drop into. But tell me, did you find nothing unexpected or suggestive about those bones, as to their number and condition, for instance?" "Well, I thought it a little queer that the scapula and the clavicle should be there. I should have expected him to cut the arm off at the shoulder joint." "Yes," said Thorndyke, "so should I. And so it has been done in every case of dismemberment that I am acquainted with. To an ordinary person, the arm seems to join on to the trunk at the shoulder joint, and that is where he would naturally sever it. What explanation do you suggest of this unusual mode of severing the arm?" "Do you think the fellow could have been a butcher?" I asked, remembering Dr. Summers' remark. "This is the way a shoulder of mutton is taken off." "No," replied Thorndyke. "A butcher includes the scapula in a shoulder of mutton for a specific purpose, namely, to take off a given quantity of meat. And also, as a sheep has no clavicle, it is the easiest way to detach the limb. But I imagine a butcher would find himself in difficulties if he attempted to take off a man's arm in that way. The clavicle would be a new and perplexing feature. Then, too, a butcher does not deal very delicately with his subject. If he has to divide a joint, he just cuts through it and does not trouble himself to avoid marking the bones. But you note here that there is not a single scratch or score on any one of the bones, not even where the finger was removed. Now, if you have ever prepared bones for a museum, as I have, you will remember the extreme care that is necessary in disarticulating joints to avoid disfiguring the articular ends of the bones with cuts and scratches." "Then you think that the person who dismembered this body must have had some anatomical knowledge and skill?" "That is what has been suggested. The suggestion is not mine." "Then I infer that you don't agree?" Thorndyke smiled. "I am sorry to be so cryptic, Berkeley, but you understand that I can't make statements. Still, I am trying to lead you to make certain inferences from the facts that are in your possession." "If I make the right inferences, will you tell me?" I asked. "It won't be necessary," he answered with the same quiet smile. "When you have fitted the puzzle together, you don't need to be told you have done it." It was most infernally tantalizing. I pondered on the problem with a scowl of such intense cogitation that Thorndyke laughed outright. "It seems to me," I said at length, "that the identity of the remains is the primary question, and that it is a question of fact. It doesn't seem any use to speculate about it." "Exactly. Either these bones are the remains of John Bellingham, or they are not. There will be no doubt on the subject when all the bones are assembled, if ever they are. And the settlement of that question will probably throw light on the further question: who deposited them in the places in which they were found? But to return to your observations. Did you gather nothing from the other bones? From the complete state of the neck vertebrae, for instance?" "Well, it did strike me as rather odd that the fellow should have gone to the trouble of separating the atlas from the skull. He must have been pretty handy with the scalpel to have done it as cleanly as he seems to have done. But I don't see why he should have gone about the business in the most inconvenient way. You notice the uniformity of method? He has separated the head from the spine instead of cutting through the spine lower down, as most persons would have done. He removed the arms with the entire shoulder girdle, instead of simply cutting them off at the shoulder joints. Even in the thighs, the same peculiarity appears, for in neither case was the kneecap found with the thigh bone, although it seems to have been searched for. Now, the obvious way to divide the leg is to cut through the patellar ligament, leaving the kneecap attached to the thigh. But in this case, the kneecap appears to have been left attached to the shank. Can you explain why this person should have adopted this unusual and rather inconvenient method? Can you suggest a motive for this procedure, or can you think of any circumstance which might lead a person to adopt this method by preference? It seems as if he wished, for some reason, to divide the body into definite anatomical regions. Thorndyke chuckled. You are not offering that suggestion as an explanation, are you? Because it would require more explaining than the original problem, and it is not even true. Anatomically speaking, the kneecap appertains to the thigh rather than to the shank. It is a sesamoid bone belonging to the thigh muscles, yet in this case it has been left attached, apparently, to the shank. No, Berkeley, that cat won't jump. Our unknown operator was not preparing a skeleton as a museum specimen. He was dividing a body up into convenient-sized portions for the purpose of conveying them to various ponds. Now, what circumstances might have led him to divide it in this peculiar manner? I am afraid I have no suggestions to offer. Have you? Thorndyke suddenly lapsed into ambiguity. I think, he said, it is possible to conceive such circumstances, and so probably will you, if you think it over. Did you gather anything of importance from the evidence of the inquest? I asked. It is difficult to say, he replied. The whole of my conclusions in this case are based on what is virtually circumstantial evidence. I have not one single fact of which I can say that it admits only of a single interpretation. Still, it must be remembered that even the most inconclusive facts, if sufficiently multiplied, yield a highly conclusive total. And my little pile of evidence is growing, particle by particle. But we mustn't sit here gossiping at this hour of the day. I have to consult with Marchmont, and you say that you have an early afternoon engagement. We can walk together as far as Fleet Street. A minute or two later we went our respective ways, Thorndyke toward Lombard Street and I to Fetter Lane, not unmindful of those coming events that were casting so agreeable a shadow before them. There was only one message awaiting me, and when Adolphus had delivered it, amidst mephitic fumes that rose from the basement, premonitory of Fried Place, I pocketed my stethoscope and betook myself to Gunpowder Alley, the aristocratic abode of my patient, joyfully threading the now familiar passages of Gough Square and Wine Office Court, and meditating pleasantly on the curious literary flavor that pervades these little-known regions. For the shade of the author of Rasselas still seems to haunt the scenes of his titanic labors and his ponderous but homely and temperate rejoicings. Every court and alley whispers of books and of the making of books. Forms of type trundled noisily on trolleys by ink-smeared boys salute the wayfarer at odd corners. Piles of strawboard, rolls or bales of paper, drums of printing ink or roller compositions stand on the pavement outside dark entries. Basement windows give glimpses into Hadean caverns tenanted by legions of printers' devils, and the very air is charged with the hum of press and with odors of glue and paste and oil. The entire neighborhood is given up to the printer and binder, and even my patient turned out to be a guillotine knife grinder, a ferocious and revolutionary calling strangely at variance with his harmless appearance and meek bearing. I was in good time at my tryst, despite the hindrances of Fried Place and invalid guillotinists. But early as I was, Miss Bellingham was already waiting in the garden. She had been filling a bowl with flowers, ready to sally forth. "It is quite like old times," she said, as we turned into Fetter Lane, "to be going to the museum together. It brings back the Tel al Amar tablets and all your kindness and unselfish labor. I suppose we shall walk there today?" "Certainly," I replied. "I am not going to share your society with the common mortals who ride in omnibuses. That would be sheer sinful waste. Besides, it is more companionable to walk." "Yes, it is. And the bustle of the streets makes one more appreciative of the quiet of the museum. What are we going to look at when we get there?" "You must decide that," I replied. "You know the collection much better than I do." "Well, now," she mused, "I wonder what you would like to see, or, in other words, what I should like you to see. The old English pottery is rather fascinating, especially the Fulmer ware. I rather think I shall take you to see that." She reflected a while, and then, just as we reached the gate of Staple Inn, she stopped and looked thoughtfully down the Gray's Inn Road. "You have taken a great interest in our case, as Dr. Thorndyke calls it. Would you like to see the churchyard where Uncle John wished to be buried? It is a little out of our way, but we are not in a hurry, are we?" I certainly was not. Any deviation that might prolong our walk was welcome, and as to the place, why, all places were alike to me, if only she were by my side. Besides, the churchyard was really of some interest, since it was undoubtedly the exciting cause of the obnoxious paragraph 2 of the will. I accordingly expressed a desire to make its acquaintance, and we crossed to the entrance of Gray's Inn Road. "Do you ever try," she asked as we turned down the dingy thoroughfare, "to picture familiar places as they looked a couple of 100 years ago?" "Yes," I answered, "and very difficult I find it. One has to manufacture the materials for reconstruction, and then the present aspect of the place will keep obtruding itself. But some places are easier to reconstitute than others." "That is what I find," said she. "Now Holborn, for example, is quite easy to reconstruct, though I dare say the imaginary form isn't a bit like the original. But there are fragments left, like Staple Inn and the front of Gray's Inn, and then one has seen prints of the old Middle Row and some of the taverns, so that one has some material with which to help out one's imagination. But this road we are walking in always baffles me. It looks so old and yet is, for the most part, so new that I find it impossible to make a satisfactory picture of its appearance. Say, when Sir Roger de Coverley might have strolled in Gray's Inn walks, or farther back, when Francis Bacon had chambers in the inn." "I imagine," said I, "that part of the difficulty is in the mixed character of the neighborhood. Here on the one side is old Gray's Inn, not much changed since Bacon's time. His chambers are still to be seen, I think, over the gateway. And there, on the Clerkenwell side, is a dense and rather squalid neighborhood, which has grown up over a region partly rural and wholly fugitive in character. Places like Bagnigge Wells and Hockley in the whole would not have had many buildings that were likely to survive, and in the absence of surviving specimens, the imagination hasn't much to work from." "I dare say you are right," said she. "Certainly the purlieus of old Clerkenwell present a very confused picture to me, whereas, in the case of an old street like, say, Great Ormond Street, one has only to sweep away the modern buildings and replace them with glorious old houses like the few that remain, dig up the roadway and pavements and lay down cobblestones, plant a few wooden posts, hang up 1 or 2 oil lamps, and the transformation is complete. And a very delightful transformation it is." "Very delightful. Which, by the way, is a melancholy thought, for we ought to be doing better work than our forefathers, whereas what we actually do is to pull down the old buildings, clap the doorways, porticos, paneling, and mantels in our museums, and then run up something inexpensive and useful and deadly uninteresting in their place." My companion looked at me and laughed softly. "For a naturally cheerful and even gay young man," said she, "you are most amazingly pessimistic. The mantle of Jeremiah, if ever he wore one, seems to have fallen on you, but without in the least impairing your good spirits, except in regard to matters architectural." "I have much to be thankful for," said I. "Am I not taken to the museum by a fair lady, and does she not stay me with mummy cases and comfort me with crockery?" "Pottery," she corrected. And then, as we met a party of grave-looking women emerging from a side street, she said, "I suppose those are lady medical students." "Yes, on their way to the Royal Free Hospital. Note the gravity of their demeanor and contrast it with the levity of the male student." "I was doing so," she answered, "and wondering why professional women are usually so much more serious than men." "Perhaps," I suggested, "it is a matter of selection. A peculiar type of woman is attracted to the professions, whereas every man has to earn his living as a matter of course." "Yes, I dare say that is the explanation. This is our turning." We passed into Heathcote Street, at the end of which was an open gate giving entrance to one of those disused and metamorphosed burial grounds that are to be met with in the older districts of London, in which the dispossessed dead are jostled into corners to make room for the living. Many of the headstones were still standing, and others, displaced to make room for asphalted walks and seats, were ranged by the walls exhibiting inscriptions made meaningless by their removal. It was a pleasant enough place on this summer afternoon, contrasted with the dingy streets whence we had come, though its grass was faded and yellow, and the twitter of the birds in the trees mingled with the hideous board-school drawls of the children who played around the seats and the few remaining tombs. "So this is the last resting place of the illustrious house of Bellingham," said I.